My name's Hazem Gaber, and today we're going to talk about writing code. We're going to talk about libraries and frameworks. So, what's a library? Well, we don't want to reinvent the wheel when we write a computer program. So, instead, we create, we buy, or we borrow, or we incorporate what's called a library. And a library is a big set of functions that somebody wrote for us. So it could be small, it could be huge, it could do one thing, it could do 800 things. But basically, a library is like a giant toolbox. And, you know, if you're installing drywall, for example, what do you need? You need a drywall saw, you need a drill, you need um, a shaving device to shave the drywall. You need a ruler, you need a tape measure, you need a knife. So when you're installing drywall, you don't go out and reinvent a drill, right? You just buy a drill. So you can think of your drywall toolbox like a library. Every time you need to do something, you just um, you just borrow one of those tools and you incorporate that into your work. And you can modify the drill a little bit. For example, you can you can change the drill bit. So if your project requires a Phillips screw, then you use a Phillips bit, and if your project requires uh, a square bit, then you use a square bit, and if your project requires a flathead, then you use a flathead bit. But the point is, you can modify this a little bit, and you can do that with the library as well. So the library adds functionality. We have to be careful though that when we trust the person that created the library, because if you take code that's that some guy created that you don't know how legitimate it is, you could be incorporating backdoors or malware into your application. And you also have to be wary of whether you're hosting the library yourself or whether you're outsourcing that. There's a lot of um, there's a lot of services that host libraries, especially for web applications, and then you don't even copy the library's code to your own server. You just reference the URL of the external host, and that's, in my opinion, a bad idea. It's a habit that a lot of people use. Um, they do it because it reduces the load on their server, but every time somebody goes to your website, they're loading. There's a section in the header of your website that says load all these libraries, and so your website loads from your server, and then the libraries start loading from external servers. So if somebody on one of those external servers was malicious, they could just swap the code one day. Or if they didn't like you, they could swap the code that your website receives and you get some malicious code. Or they might shut their server down one day and then your website doesn't function. So there's a lot of um, things you have to consider. You also have to consider the license. So what does this library cost? And is it a one time fee or do you have to pay a royalty? Do you have to pay for every copy of the app you sell? So basically, as I said, a library tells us we write our program and then we include the functions from the library, and the library has to be part of our program. And so it adds functionality, but we run the show. Now, the opposite of that is a framework. So a framework is a big program that runs on its own, and then we write an app, and our app uh, runs within the framework. So the framework runs the show, and if we really hate pieces of the framework, we can exclude them from um, operating on our app, but not necessarily. The framework might have its own libraries. So you can think of like uh, Windows. So .NET, for example, is a huge framework that was created by Microsoft. And it makes it easy for applications to run in Windows. And if you look at, a Windows application, they all look the same. They all have the same style of file menus, the same print dialog box, the same um, save dialog box. And the reason is Microsoft built that framework. So it's like, do you build a standalone store like a Walmart, or do you build a store inside of a shopping mall? The shopping mall is a framework. The shopping mall supplies power, internet, possibly. They supply the hallways, the ventilation, fire alarm, and you just build, you know, within you build within that store, and then you build within that space your store. So a shopping mall is kind of a framework, and then the mall adds, uh, so you have common, and the mall adds you to their directory, just like your program uh, adds to the start menu. And you can make some changes. You can make your own print dialog box if you want, but why do that? Why put the effort, and why uh, detract from the user experience when the user is already familiar with the print dialog box that all the other applications have? Now, .NET's great because you can use any number of programming languages and still uh, use a Microsoft framework. And the other thing that .NET does and that Windows does is a common ground for interacting with computer hardware, such as mouse, keyboard, webcam. You don't have to think about any of that. And then we have Angular, which is a web framework for writing apps. So Angular, so remember going back to an earlier presentation, I said that your web browser only understands three languages: HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So, at the end of the day, the code that ends up on the user's computer has to be HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So, it doesn't matter what framework or language or whatever idea you have on your server. At the end of the day, you can build your web app any way you want, but at the end of the day, your web app has to deliver HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So Angular was developed by Google to make it easy to build apps. And it's self-written in JavaScript, but it has its own language. So you write some code that the JavaScript interprets and then generates a HTML JavaScript page. So in order to use Angular, you do have to understand the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and also TypeScript, which is a JavaScript that was invented. It's a more strict version of JavaScript. So JavaScript has a ton of libraries, and the most popular is jQuery. I use jQuery. It adds a lot of functionality. I suggest you try it out if you're using JavaScript. Any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you.